Hey guys, how's it going? My name's Justin. Today I'm looking at the Unparallel Phaser Pedal from the Extreme series from ENO Music. Alright, let's get into it. So, first I'm going to show some clean tones with that phaser. Before I do that, here's the clean tone, totally dry. Alright, first of all, I have everything right at 50% here, all four knobs. Here's that tone. Alright, so the sound is basically just a nice slow sweeping effect. I've got my depth at 25, my bias at 75, the rate at 25, and the regen at about 50. You could use this especially in like an acoustic setting, maybe on a bridge to make that part pop a little bit more, make your tone sound a little more interesting than just your straight dry sound. Alright, so here's the same tone, but with the bias at about 50. So the bias and regen are at 50, the depth and rate are at about 25. Same sort of effect, but this just won't have as much of that high end in there. It'll concentrate more on the lower register of what you're playing. So if you have a really bright sounding guitar, this will help to mellow out the tone a little bit while still having that movement of the sweep up and down. Alright, so a little bit more of a noticeable tone here. I've got the depth at 25, the bias and rate at about 75, and the regen at about 50. This is just a little bit more swampy, sort of a warbly sort of tone to it. You can tell with that rate knob higher that the sweep is a lot faster. It oscillates between that high and low filter a lot quicker. Alright, last clean tone here. This is just a really slow sweep. This will give you just a little bit of motion to your playing, especially if you're doing like a solo, sort of singer-songwriter sort of thing. And I've got the depth at 0, the bias at 100, the rate at 25, and the regen at about 100. It's pretty drastic when it actually does switch between that high and low filter, but if you want something to really pop out in a certain part of a song, that'll definitely do the trick. Alright, so now I've engaged my distortion pedal here, so just for reference, here is my dry distorted tone with no phaser on it. Alright, so I've got my phaser in front of my distortion pedal. This is totally a personal preference thing. I just think that the phaser sounds a lot smoother, a lot nicer in front of the distortion, but some people do like the more drastic sound of having that phaser after your distortion, so you can try out either one, see which one works for you. Here's the depth at 0, the bias at 100, the rate at 25, and the regen at 100. Like we saw with the clean tone with the same settings, this is going to be a very slow sweep with a very drastic change between that high and low filter. Alright, so here I have the depth at 0, the bias at 50, the rate at 50, and the regen at 100. This is a pretty affected tone. This probably isn't a tone you'd want to use throughout a whole set, but if you've got a song or maybe a riff that has a little bit more of maybe like a punky Britpop sort of sound to it, this can certainly make a little bit of motion within your tone here. Alright, you can't play around with a phaser pedal without using the classic slow sweep sort of sound. I've got the depth and regen at about 75%, the bias at about 50%, and the rate at about 25%. And if you have a phaser pedal, I think it's a law that you play this song, so... Alright, so here's a much more drastic affected sort of tone. I've got the depth and the bias at about 50, and I have the rate and regen both at 100. Kind of along the same lines, but a little less extreme, a little more subtle. The depth and the bias are still at 50, but I've got the rate at 75, and I brought the regen down to about 50 as well. This just gives sort of a warble that would make a certain part of a song really stand out. As you can see, like with a lot of phaser pedals, you hear that effect a lot more when you're holding a chord or a note steady. So if you're playing a lot of really fast, dynamic, really involved parts, you might not hear that phaser sweep as drastically as if you're holding a note or a chord steady, but it does give you a little bit more motion, a little bit more feel and sort of texture to what you're playing sometimes. So for example, if I hold this chord steady, that warble is really noticeable and really pronounced, whereas if I'm playing like this, you can't necessarily hear the specific sweep that the phaser pedal is making, but you can tell that there's a little bit of motion and a little bit of texture layered on top of what the guitar itself is playing. And this certainly works really well for lead playing as well. If you're soloing and you maybe want to make your sound a little less static, this can definitely lend that sort of texture to your playing. Alright, so this last tone is a really useful tone if you just want to add a little bit of like beefiness and motion to your playing. A lot of what a phaser pedal can be used really well for is just making a part stand out a little bit more, maybe separating the bridge from the verses and choruses, or maybe separating your solo from a lead you were playing in the part before. So here the depth and the bias are at about 50, and the rate and regen are at about 25. It's not a super textured or affected sound, but it does give you a little bit more motion to what you're playing and help you separate out that part of the song a little bit. So let's say you're maybe going from the end of a verse into a bridge or something like that. So I'll start this out with just the distortion with the phaser disengaged, maybe at the end of a verse, so to speak, and then I'll go into the bridge and turn on that phaser pedal, and it just sort of portends that there's something else coming here and that it's a different part of the song. So there we have the Unparallel Phaser Pedal from the Extreme series from ENO Music. This pedal's a lot of fun for anyone looking to dive in and sort of experiment with that phaser tone. Its 4 different knobs here will give you a little more versatility than your most basic phaser pedals, but it's not so complicated that someone who isn't used to this effect can't jump right in and get some really cool tones right away. It's got a true bypass switch, a solid metal casing, and a really cool looking face, so this is a lot of fun for anyone looking to explore that phaser sort of tone. Thanks so much for watching.